She believed the test would settle a question about my marriage. None of us understood what else it was about to uncover. 3 days after I gave birth, my mother-in-law looked at my son for less than 10 seconds and decided he wasn't a Bennett. She didn't accuse me outright. She just studied him, his dark hair, his dark eyes, the shape of his nose, while my husband stood beside me and said nothing at all. Then my father-in-law tapped a blue folder on the coffee table and told me the family trust required proof. By proof, he meant blood. I tightened my arms around my newborn son and understood that his first fight had started before I'd even carried him up the stairs. My name is Claire Bennett. I was 38 when I came home from the hospital with Ethan still sore, still bleeding, running on less than 2 hours of sleep. Daniel and I had lived in that house for 8 years. I knew the front door stuck when the weather turned cold. I knew the third stair complained under heavy footsteps. That afternoon, none of it felt like mine. Margaret sat on the sofa with her back perfectly straight, composed the way she was at church fundraisers, not like a grandmother meeting her first grandson. Richard stood by the fireplace. The folder sat between them on the table like it had been waiting for us. Nobody offered to help with the diaper bag. Nobody asked how the delivery went or whether I needed to sit down. Daniel set Ethan's car seat near the sofa, and for one ridiculous second I thought we should have called first, like bringing our own baby into our own home required an appointment. Margaret rose. I thought she might finally reach for him. Instead, she leaned over the car seat and studied him the way you'd study a stranger's photograph. "His hair is very dark," she said. Daniel gave a tired smile. "Babies change, Mom." She didn't look at him. Neither side of this family has hair like that. Ethan slept through it, one fist tucked under his chin. "Margaret," I said. She straightened but didn't apologize. Richard cleared his throat. "Before Ethan can be added to the Bennett Trust, there's something we need to address." He opened the folder like he'd rehearsed the motion in front of a mirror. "The trust has a lineage clause. Normally a birth certificate and a sworn declaration are enough. But once parentage has been formally challenged, the trustees are required to verify the direct bloodline before anyone new is added as a beneficiary." "Formally challenged by whom?" Margaret answered before Richard could. "By us. Richard and I signed a written challenge with the trust attorney 2 days ago." That detail landed harder than the accusation itself. This wasn't a suspicion spoken out loud in a living room. It was already paperwork. "You want a paternity test?" I said. "We want certainty," Margaret said. I looked at Daniel, waiting for him to be angry to tell his parents to leave. Instead, he stared at the folder like there might be a sentence inside it that would let him off the hook without choosing a side. His silence hurt more than anything Margaret had said. 6 years of trying had brought us to that room. 2 miscarriages, 1 failed treatment cycle that left me in a hospital bed apologizing to Daniel for something my own body had done without my permission. Margaret had never said a cruel word about any of it directly. She'd only asked once in a voice gentle enough that it took me a full 10 seconds to feel the insult, whether Daniel had considered other ways to have a family. I'd convinced myself Ethan would end all of that. A living, breathing child would make every old judgment look small and unnecessary. He'd been alive 72 hours, and they were already asking him to earn his father's last name. "If there's nothing to hide, this shouldn't be a problem," Margaret said, and I recognized the sentence. She'd used versions of it my whole marriage. Object and I looked defensive. Agree, and I helped her pretend the insult was reasonable. Daniel finally spoke. "Maybe we should just do it, Claire. Then they'll have nothing left to say." He wasn't accusing me. He was doing what he always did, asking the person with less power in the room to absorb the conflict, so he wouldn't have to. "Do you think he's yours?" I asked him. His head came up fast. "Of course he is." "Then tell them no." He glanced toward his parents. It was brief. It was still there. "This isn't personal," Richard said. "Once a formal challenge is filed, the trustees can't ignore it. It became personal the moment you brought that folder into my house before asking if I could walk without pain." I wanted them gone. But refusing wouldn't end it. Margaret would carry this into every holiday for the rest of Ethan's life, whether we tested or not. so I made a decision. "Fine," I said. Daniel exhaled, and I held up a hand before he could look relieved. "But we do this exactly by the clause. No private results, no selective testing. Whoever the trust says needs to give a sample gives one, including a sample from me, since apparently even Ethan's mother needs to be part of the chain of custody. And everyone is in the room when the report is opened. Everyone." For half a second, Margaret's eyes flicked toward Richard. Then her face settled back into something calm. "Agreed." "That's reasonable," Richard said. Later, when the technician explained the paperwork, I understood why my agreement mattered more than I'd realized. The clause didn't call for a simple father-child swab. Once formally invoked, it required verification of the entire direct beneficiary line from Ethan to Daniel, and from Daniel to the generation through which his own trust rights had been established in the first place. Nobody explained that part to me in the living room. I don't think Richard fully understood it either. But Margaret, when she finally saw the consent forms 2 days later, sat with them a long time before she signed anything at all. And at the time I mistook her hesitation for irritation. I had no idea yet what she was actually deciding whether to survive. 2 days after that afternoon in our living room, an email arrived from the family attorney with the consent packet attached. I read through it at the kitchen table while Ethan slept against my chest, and the language was dense but not impossible to follow if you were paying attention. The clause didn't call for a simple father and son swab. Once formally invoked, it required verification of the entire direct beneficiary line starting with Ethan and working back through Daniel, and from Daniel through whichever generation had originally established his own rights under the trust. It wasn't a test. It was an audit of a bloodline, and it went further back than any of us in that living room seemed to understand at the time. Daniel signed his forms without reading past the signature line the way he signed most things that came from his father's attorney. Richard signed the same afternoon he received them. Margaret took hers home. I only knew that because Daniel mentioned it almost as an aside 2 nights later. "She's still got the papers. Said she wanted to read them properly before signing." "Your mother doesn't read anything properly. She skims and decides." He almost laughed. "Not this time, I guess. I didn't think much of it then. I had a newborn who wouldn't sleep unless he was held upright, and a husband who was trying in small physical ways to make up for what he hadn't said out loud in that living room. He took every late feeding he could manage. He learned to change a diaper one-handed while I finished eating. He fell asleep some nights in the chair beside the bassinet instead of our bed, like proximity to Ethan was something he could offer as an apology. It helped. It didn't erase the fact that neither of us had told his parents no. I'd heard about the trust years earlier, back when Daniel and I were still unpacking boxes in our first house. He'd found an old photograph of himself as a teenager, standing next to Richard outside the company headquarters, and I'd teased him about looking terrified. He admitted. His father had sat him down at 16 like it was a job interview and told him responsibility came before privilege, that the trust protected the family's assets, the houses, the investments, the voting shares in the company. His grandfather had added something called the lineage clause decades earlier after some legal dispute with a distant relative in the 60s, and as far as Daniel knew, it had never once been used in his lifetime. Old families don't throw away old rules, he'd said, like it was a quirky footnote and nothing more. I remember thinking it sounded almost sweet in an outdated way. I had no idea that one sentence written before either of us was born would end up sitting on our coffee table 3 days after our son arrived. There was one more thing I hadn't let myself think about too hard until now. A few weeks before Ethan was born, we'd had dinner with Daniel's Aunt Linda, who had always been the one Bennett willing to say things out loud before deciding whether they were wise. Somewhere around dessert, she mentioned an invitation she'd gotten, some Hale wedding that fall. I happened to be looking at Margaret when she said it, and for less than a full second, Margaret went still in a way that had nothing to do with the conversation. Then she smiled and asked me if I'd picked a nursery color yet, and the moment closed over like water. I hadn't connected any of it to anything, not then. The day after Richard brought out the folder, I went looking in the upstairs closet for the extra receiving blankets Margaret swore she'd left in the guest room, and instead I found an old leather photo album with a cracked spine. Wedding photos. Richard in a navy tuxedo. Margaret smiling into the camera the way people used to pose, chin down, eyes up. Vacations. Christmas mornings. Daniel's first birthday. His preschool graduation. A little league game where he was clearly the smallest kid on the field. I went through it twice before I let myself notice what wasn't there. There wasn't a single photograph of Margaret pregnant. Not one. The album went straight from the honeymoon to Daniel already sitting in her lap at what looked like 5 or 6 months old. Maybe the pictures were lost. Maybe nobody had bothered to take any. Neither explanation sat right with me, and when I went to put the album back, something slid out from a pocket stitched into the inside cover. A postcard plain yellowed at the edges, no picture on the front. On the back, in blue ink that had faded to almost gray, 6 words. M. I hope you found happiness. Tom. No address, no last name. A postmark from Hartford, Connecticut, so old the date was barely legible. I didn't recognize the handwriting. I had no reason to think it meant anything. I put it back exactly where I'd found it and went downstairs. And that night, after Ethan finally went down, I opened the Notes app on my phone and typed 4 words I couldn't yet connect to each other. Hartford postcard, missing photos, hail, trust. It looked ridiculous. I almost deleted it. I saved it instead mostly because something in me, some instinct built over 8 years of living around Margaret, had learned that when a thing felt carefully hidden, it usually was. 3 days later, Daniel came home early and told me he'd stopped by his parents' house to drop off some paperwork and found his mother alone in Richard's study doing nothing at all. Not reading, not on the phone, just sitting turning her wedding ring around her finger the way you'd worry a loose tooth. He asked if she was all right. She told him to go check on Ethan. That was also the day he called her before any of us had a single result in hand, and told her something I didn't find out about until much later because he didn't think it mattered enough to mention at the time. He'd heard from an offhand comment Richard made that Margaret had already texted the family attorney about suspending beneficiary paperwork if the child was excluded. Daniel called her directly. He didn't ask her to be quieter about it the way he might have a month earlier. He told her that whatever the report said about the trust, Ethan was his son and Claire was his wife, and she would not speak about either of us that way again to anyone for any reason. He told me about that call 3 years later, actually sitting on our back porch. At the time, all I noticed was that something in him had shifted before he had any proof at all that he needed to. The morning we drove to the clinic, nobody turned on the radio. Ethan slept in his car seat behind us, 6 weeks old, completely unaware that 4 adults were about to find out things about themselves that none of them had asked for. Daniel gripped the wheel with both hands the entire way, and I watched his knuckles stay white even at stoplights. The clinic didn't look like a place where anything difficult happened. Muted carpet, fresh flowers at the front desk, a technician named Priya, who explained every form before she let any of us sign it. When she got to the part about the scope of the testing, she said it plainly the way you'd explain a warranty. Because the lineage clause had been formally invoked, the analysis wouldn't stop at a father and son comparison. It would verify the full direct line the trust required, which meant Ethan's sample would be compared against Daniel's and Daniel's against Richard's, since Richard's own trust rights were the ones that had established the line in the first place. Richard nodded like that was obvious. Margaret asked one question. How far back does the comparison go? Priya glanced up. As far as the clause requires, in this case 2 generations. Margaret held the pen a moment longer than she needed to. Then she said, I only wanted to understand the procedure, and signed her name. I didn't think anything of it at the time. I was watching Ethan's face crumple when the swab touched the inside of his cheek, a thin, startled cry that made my whole body tense before I could stop it. Margaret didn't move. Richard tried a joke about how the Bennetts had never had trouble figuring out whose children belonged where, and nobody laughed, least of all him, once he heard how it sounded out loud. We drove home in separate cars. Daniel reached across the console and took my hand at a red light. I'm sorry, he said. I should have stopped this before it got here. Yes, I said. There wasn't much anger left in it, just the plain fact of it. That night, Ethan wouldn't settle for anyone but Daniel, and I found them both in the nursery. Daniel rocking him in the chair we'd never gotten around to sanding one armrest still bare wood. He curls his thumb exactly like I do, Daniel said, looking down at him. Would you need a lab to tell you that? No. He said it fast, like the question had cut in front of something he needed to get out. I don't need a report to know he's mine. Then why am I the one who had to prove it? He didn't have an answer that night. He found one a few days later after the two of us talked long past midnight at the kitchen table, and he admitted that saying no to his parents had always felt physically impossible to him, like a wall he didn't know how to get around, and that he didn't want Ethan growing up believing that was normal. It wasn't forgiveness yet. But for the first time since the folder had shown up on our coffee table, it felt like we were standing on the same side of the room. The wait was worse than the test itself. Margaret called almost every other day with questions that sounded harmless on the surface. Has Ethan been sleeping? Have you heard from the attorney? Daniel kept the calls short. I stopped picking up. On the 10th morning, Daniel's phone rang just after 9. He answered on speaker without checking who it was. Mr. Bennett, this is Jennifer Lawson with Heritage Genetic Services. We've completed the analysis, and there's a finding in the lineage review that our genetic counselor would like to walk through with everyone in person together. Just tell me one thing, Daniel said. Is Ethan my son? I'm sorry, Mr. Bennett. The counselor will go through the full report with the group. The call ended. Neither of us moved for a long moment. An hour later, Margaret called and suggested she and Daniel meet with the clinic privately first before the rest of us. I reached over and put her on speaker before Daniel could answer. No, I said. We agreed. Everyone's in the room when it's opened. There was a pause longer than I expected from her. Very well, she said. And for the first time in 6 years of knowing her, she didn't sound certain of anything. The conference room had soft lighting and a pitcher of water nobody touched. Dr. Melissa Grant sat across from the 5 of us with a folder that seemed heavier than paper had any right to be. She started as promised, in the order the trust request had laid out. Claire Bennett. Maternity confirmed. That relationship is fully supported by the data. Margaret said that had never been in question. I looked at her and said quietly that it never was. Daniel Bennett and Ethan Bennett. Paternity confirmed, probability exceeding 99.99%. Daniel let out a breath he'd been holding for 10 days. Richard relaxed. Margaret reached for her purse like the meeting was over. Is that everything? I asked. Dr. Grant didn't close the folder. No, there's an additional finding tied to the lineage verification the trust requested. She looked at Richard. The analysis excludes a biological father-son relationship between Richard Bennett and Daniel Bennett. Richard's hand went flat on the table, fingers spread like he was bracing against something only he could feel. There has to be a mistake. We anticipated that question, Dr. Grant said, and walked him through it. Independent processing, a repeated analysis, a second lab confirming the result, no sign of contamination or error on either sample. Margaret didn't cry. She didn't protest. She sat very still, turning her wedding ring slowly around her finger, exactly the way Daniel had once described her doing alone in Richard's study. I never let myself know for certain, she finally said. There were only a few weeks between the last time I was with someone and the first time I was with Richard. By the time I realized I was pregnant, Richard and I were already engaged. I chose the answer I could live with. Dr. Grant continued gently. Because the lineage clause had authorized a full kinship comparison, the lab had cross-referenced the unmatched sample against a genetic relative database, one that only surfaces results for profiles that have opted in to relative matching. It had returned a close match consistent with a half-sibling relationship. A man named Robert Hale. Hale, I said before I could stop myself. Every face turned toward me. Aunt Linda mentioned a Hale wedding before Ethan was born. Margaret changed the subject so fast I almost didn't notice. And there was a postcard hidden in your photo album signed Tom. Margaret closed her eyes. The shared DNA is consistent with Robert Hale being Daniel's half-brother. Dr. Grant said, though we can't rule out another close paternal relationship without direct follow-up testing. Given the family tree and the timeline, his father Thomas Hale is the most probable biological match. "Mom," Daniel said. "You knew." "I suspected," Margaret said. "I spent almost 40 years telling myself suspicion wasn't the same thing as truth." Richard finally turned not toward the folder, toward his son. "I taught you to ride a bike. I was there when you broke your arm. You were my son yesterday." His voice caught. "You still are." Daniel reached across the table and took his father's hand. For the first time all morning, nobody in that room was thinking about DNA at all. We left the clinic carrying Ethan between us, and nobody spoke until we reached the parking lot. Richard trailed a few steps behind, eyes fixed on the pavement like he'd forgotten how to look at anything else. Margaret stood near the entrance, exactly where we'd left her, as if she no longer knew which direction belonged to her. Daniel buckled Ethan into his car seat, and then leaned both hands against the roof of the car, not moving. "I don't even know what I'm supposed to feel." "You don't have to decide today," I said. "I thought today was about proving you were right." "It was." I put my hand over his. "It just turned into something bigger than that." Before we pulled out of the lot, Richard walked over and knocked lightly on my window. I rolled it down. "I let a clause in a piece of paper matter more than the woman who'd just given birth to my grandson," he said. "I should have stopped it before that folder ever came through your door. I'm sorry, Claire. I know that doesn't undo 3 days after you came home from the hospital." "I appreciate you saying that," I told him. "It doesn't erase what happened, but I hear you." It was the first time in 8 years he'd apologized to me for anything, and it was worth more than the DNA report sitting on the seat between us. 6 weeks passed before either of us spoke to Margaret or Richard again. I had no contact with her at all in that stretch. Daniel took a handful of short calls from his father, 5 minutes, sometimes less. Mostly silence with a few words wedged into it. Those 6 weeks changed our marriage more than the 6 years before them had. Daniel started seeing a therapist and came home from his second session with something he wanted to say out loud before he lost his nerve. I grew up thinking peace meant nobody raised their voice. My therapist asked me whose peace I was actually protecting. I didn't have an answer. Over the following weeks, he stepped back from his role at the company, keeping only the parts of the job he actually wanted, instead of the ones he'd inherited by default. He had an attorney move Ethan's documents into accounts separate from the Bennett Trust until the whole estate could be reviewed independently. He changed the locks on our house without making a production of it. Margaret had always kept a key. Neither of us asked for it back. The locksmith handled that conversation for us. One evening over Ethan's bedtime story, I told Daniel the only thing I still needed from him. "I don't need you to choose me once. I need you to keep choosing us." He closed the book and said he would, and there was nothing dramatic in it, which was exactly why I believed him. Richard requested a formal review of the trust that same month, not a unilateral decision, but a request routed through the trustees and the family attorney, the way anything with real legal weight had to move. Months later, after that review, and a vote among the trustees, the mandatory DNA provision was struck wherever the documents allowed it to be. Richard told the board in a meeting Daniel later described to me almost word for word that the purpose of a family trust was to protect the family, not to teach it to distrust itself. He also asked the trustees to accept Margaret's resignation from the trust committee effective immediately. Nobody forced that decision out of him. He said he couldn't in good conscience leave her holding power over a clause she'd used against a woman 3 days postpartum. Margaret called for weeks. She wrote letters. She asked Daniel to arrange dinner. I wasn't ready, and for the first time in my marriage, I let myself say so plainly instead of politely working around it. When she finally came to the house a month after the clinic, she stood on the porch holding a sealed envelope and didn't ask to come in, didn't ask to hold Ethan. She just handed it to me and left. I read it with Daniel that night. 4 pages, and too many of them said things got out of hand. Mistakes were made, I misunderstood. Daniel read it twice, and then set it down. "You never named what you actually did," he told her on the phone with me sitting beside him. "You accused Claire of betraying her husband. You questioned whether Ethan belonged in his own family. You used a trust to pressure a woman 3 days after childbirth into proving something no mother should ever have to prove. 2 days later, she came back without a letter, just words looking at me directly for the first time since Ethan was born. "I accused you of being unfaithful. I tried to take your son's place in this family away before he was 2 weeks old. I used fear and money because I told myself I was protecting my family. I was wrong." "I believe you're sorry," I said. "Trust comes back a lot slower than an apology does." She nodded like she'd expected that answer and didn't argue with it. Her return happened slowly after that. Short visits with Daniel in the room first, then a birthday, then eventually ordinary Sunday afternoons, one respected boundary at a time, never assumed, never automatic. Daniel wrote to Robert Hale himself a few weeks later. No attorney, no company letterhead, just a man introducing himself and explaining what had happened with his phone number at the bottom, and nothing asked for in return. Robert never called. Instead, 3 weeks after that, an envelope arrived with a single photograph inside. Thomas Hale, maybe 28 years old, standing outside an old manufacturing plant in Hartford, laughing at someone out of frame. Tucked behind it was a short note in unfamiliar handwriting. "I'm not ready to talk yet, but I thought you deserved to see him." Daniel held that photograph a long time. "I always wondered where my smile came from," he finally said, and neither of us needed to say anything else about it. We took it for what it was, not an invitation, just an acknowledgement, and put it away. 3 years later, on an ordinary Sunday, Ethan ran across our backyard with a plastic airplane, and Richard chased him down with the specific determination only grandfathers seem to have, then lifted him onto his shoulders without hesitation. Sometimes, when he thought nobody was watching, I caught him looking at old photographs a little longer than he needed to. He never once questioned whether Daniel was his son again. That didn't mean the betrayal had stopped hurting somewhere underneath it. Both things were true at once, and I'd learned that was allowed. Margaret stood near the porch, talking quietly with Daniel. She paused now before offering advice more than she used to. Some of the old instinct still showed up in her face sometimes, but she'd learned that not every thought she had needed to become someone else's burden to carry. Watching all of them together, I understood something I hadn't been able to put into words that first afternoon in our living room. Margaret hadn't lost her family. She'd lost the power to define it. There's a difference, and some days I think that loss weighs on her more than any apology ever could. If this story meant something to you, I'd really love to hear how you'd have handled it. Would you have let Margaret back in slowly the way we did, or would that accusation have ended things for good in your family? Tell me in the comments what you would have done in Claire's place. And if you believe family is something you build through honesty and the willingness to face hard truths instead of bury them, I'd be glad to have you back for the next one.